Hey Grace Church, I'm Jordan. I live in North Raleigh. Just quick story from the harvest. Last Tuesday, I got to get out and knock on doors here. So we just wore masks and social distance, but still went out and knocked on doors in Northridge Apartments. And when I knocked on it was actually the last door I was knocking on last Tuesday evening. A guy named Mike opened up, and right away he said, "Are you Jehovah's Witness?" And we said, "No." He said, "Are you Baptist?" And I said, "I follow Jesus." And he said, "Are you Baptist?" And I said, "I follow Jesus." And he said, "Well, I'm Baptist. I became a believer 2 months ago." I said, "Really? Tell me the story." And Mike lived in Massachusetts for most of his life and moved to Raleigh about 3 months ago. But while he lived in Massachusetts about a year and a half ago, a man named Brian came into the bank that Mike works at, and he was extremely outgoing and fun, which is not normal for people in the North apparently. And so this caught Mike's attention, and so he walked over as Brian's making a transaction with one of his coworkers, and just began to talk, like spark a conversation with this guy. And Brian, at that bank, shared the gospel with Mike, and Mike didn't believe right there when he shared the gospel with him, but he did say, "Yeah, I would love to know more about this." And so he went back and began to study. He refused to study the Bible with him, so they actually studied the Case for Christ, the book, and read it chapter by chapter. And at first, Mike began to make fun of Brian. He was like, "You believe in God? Yeah, I believe in Santa Claus." And then after time, he began to be more and more open until finally they finished the book together. And Brian was hoping Mike would give his life to Christ, and he didn't. And so they lost touch after some months, and Mike ended up moving to Raleigh, and they hadn't talked in about a half a year. And while Mike was here in Raleigh, he, man, right when COVID hit several months ago, Mike was not supposed to make it back home in time to be here. He was supposed to go to the Dominican Republic, but last second he and his wife decided not to do that by chance and decided to go to Vegas instead. And in Vegas, flights booked up pretty quickly to get back here after they had a party vacation. And so as they're trying to get back in town, they ended up getting the last flight on the last day of their vacation and being the last ones to be on the plane. So they just barely made it back to Raleigh on the day they wanted to get here. And that was it. There was no miracle necessarily in that story. But because he felt there's no way this is a coincidence that I made it back to Raleigh in time, he thought there has to be a God, and it must be the God that Brian told me about a year ago, and gave his life to Christ right there, and started looking through his old notes and papers to try to find out how he could reach out to Brian and tell him, "Hey, I just gave my life to Jesus." So we knocked on his door and met him, and he said, "I had just talked to Brian, and Brian's trying to help me find a church here in Raleigh." And so he sent me a bunch of options, and so now we get to walk with Mike as a new believer. He hasn't been baptized yet, so actually tomorrow I'm going to jump on Zoom with him, and we're going to start walking through the commands of Christ. So that was just a sweet story, super encouraging. I can't imagine what it was like to be Brian, and he get that call, hey, a year later after sharing the gospel with this guy, he calls you back to say he gave his life to Christ.